I funded the renovation of my grandparents' farmhouse entirely on my own. A $310,000 restoration I'd been quietly planning for 3 years. When I finally drove out to surprise them on their 45th anniversary, my grandmother was sitting on the front steps in her housecoat at noon, and my grandfather, a man who had spent his entire life solving his own problems in silence, had left me a voicemail that said only, "Morgan, please get here when you can. Something's happening." My aunt's car was already in the gravel lot. So was a van I didn't recognize, backed up to the side entrance with the doors open. My name is Morgan. I'm 34. I work in healthcare compliance auditing, which means I spend my professional life reading the language institutions use when they want to appear generous while protecting their interests. I know which provisions hold and which ones dissolve the moment someone with a financial motive starts asking questions. I didn't come to this work by accident. My grandfather was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's when I was 21. My grandmother absorbed the change like soil takes rain, completely without drama, without announcing it to anyone. She reconfigured their entire life around his needs over the course of about 6 months. She learned to manage his medication schedule with the precision of a pharmacist. She tracked the progression, researched every new treatment option, and laughed at every joke he still managed to make with shaking hands. Neither of them ever asked anyone for help. That was simply who they were. So I decided to give it without being asked. The farmhouse had been in the family for 40 years but had never been properly winterized, never made accessible, never updated past the early 1980s. When I found the right contractor, someone I'd known professionally for years and trusted, I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents. Not my Aunt Delia, who is 5 years older than me and has always occupied the space in our family where competence should be without providing much of the actual substance. I drew up the scope myself, pulled the permits personally, and oversaw every phase. Wide doorways. A zero-threshold shower. Grab bars designed to look like brushed brass towel rails. A kitchen counter section lowered to accommodate my grandfather's reach on days when the tremors were bad. A wraparound porch so he could always find a chair in the sun without stairs. Total cost, $310,000. I financed it myself, including prepaid property taxes for 10 years and a household account. I placed the deed into an irrevocable trust naming my grandparents as sole lifetime beneficiaries. Then I arranged the surprise. I told them I was taking them to a nice dinner for their anniversary. I drove them an hour and a half into the hill country instead, down a road they hadn't been on in years. When they recognized the farmhouse, restored, lit up, completely transformed, my grandmother pressed both hands against the truck window and made a sound I will never forget. My grandfather asked me twice if this was real. Then he got out of the truck and walked up the porch steps without his cane, stood at the railing and looked out over the yard for a very long time. "I thought this place was finished," he finally said. "I thought we were going to have to let it go." "It's not going anywhere," I told him. "Your names are in the trust. Nobody can sell it. Nobody can change how it's used. It's yours for as long as you want it." We spent that first weekend eating on the porch and watching the light move across the hills. I helped him figure out the shower hardware. My grandmother reorganized every cabinet twice. On Sunday, I drove back to the city feeling something settle inside me that had been restless for years. I should have known it wouldn't stay quiet for long. My grandmother, who has never been able to hold happiness inside herself when she's truly feeling it, mentioned the farmhouse to Delia during a phone call 3 days later. Delia asked for the address. My grandmother called me that evening, her voice doing the thing it does when she's trying to hold two feelings apart. "Delia wants to come see it this weekend. Her and Marcus and the kids. Just for the day." She paused. "I wanted to check with you first." That pause told me everything. I had a filing deadline and a client dispute I couldn't hand off, so I didn't drive out that Saturday. I told myself Delia was curious, not calculating. I told myself the legal structure was airtight. I was wrong on the second point, and deliberately naive on the first. My grandfather's voicemail arrived Monday morning while I was in a review meeting. I stepped into the hallway to listen to it twice. His voice was measured in the way it gets when he is very carefully not alarming anyone. "Morgan, I need you to come when you can. Marcus has been making some calls about the property. There's a folder on the kitchen table I don't recognize. I don't fully understand what's being proposed, and I didn't agree to any of it. I was in my car within the hour. I knew something had shifted before I reached the driveway." Marcus's truck was pulled up close to the side entrance. Through the windshield I watched him walk the length of the porch heel to toe, counting under his breath, phone raised to photograph the exterior. He didn't hear me park. Inside, my grandmother was standing at the kitchen window with the look she wears when she's carrying more than she should have to. My grandfather was at the table in front of an open manila folder. Delia was in the sitting room rearranging the bookshelf as though she'd lived there for years. Finally, she said with the warm, slightly wounded smile I'd grown up watching. "We've been trying to reach you." I set down my bag. "What is in that folder?" She told me Marcus had run numbers on short-term rental income. Conservative projections of $30,000 to $40,000 per season, a management company that would handle everything, our grandparents' welcome whenever the property wasn't booked. The back door opened, and Marcus came in from the porch, already carrying the room the way people do when they've decided the conversation is settled. He dropped a printed page on the table. "Rental projection. I've already talked to 2 platforms. We could have a live listing by the end of the week." I looked at the document. Then I looked at him. "You've already listed it. Draft listing. Preliminary." He sat down the way you sit in your own home. "Look, you put in serious work here. Nobody's trying to cut you out. We're talking about maximizing an underused asset." "It's not an asset," I said. "It's their home." My grandmother came to stand beside my grandfather and put her hand on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. I took one slow breath, then went to my car and retrieved my work bag. I have a habit that my colleagues understand and people like Marcus tend to underestimate. Every significant transaction I'm involved in receives the same documentation treatment, regardless of whether it's personal or professional. I had brought the full file. I placed the first document on the table. The deed recorded with the county 9 months ago, held in an irrevocable trust with my grandparents as sole lifetime beneficiaries. I read the relevant clause aloud. The trust instrument granted them exclusive and unconditional right of occupancy, with no provision for subletting short-term rental or commercial use of any kind without written consent from the trustee. "And you're the trustee," Delia said. "I am. My obligation is to ensure the property is used according to its terms. Those terms exist to protect them." Marcus leaned back. Trust language can always be challenged. I placed the second document in front of him. A written legal opinion from an estate attorney confirming the trust structure was valid, properly recorded, and not subject to challenge by non-beneficiaries. "Non-beneficiaries," I said, "means everyone in this room except the 2 of them." The kitchen was very quiet. I placed a third document on the table. A screenshot of the draft rental listing Marcus had uploaded that morning, with photographs taken from our grandparents' front porch. The platform account was registered to his business address. I had submitted a fraud report to the platform's compliance team 2 hours earlier, citing misrepresentation of ownership. Then a fourth document, the county ordinance governing short-term rentals in this jurisdiction. Special use permit required. Health inspection required. No permit on file for this address because no application had ever been filed. Violation fines up to $7,500 per instance. And finally a cease and desist addressed jointly to Delia and Marcus, formally notifying them that any further attempt to list, market, photograph for commercial use, or misrepresent the property would be treated as tortious interference with the trust. Marcus stared at the documents. The warmth had gone out of his face entirely. "We're family," he said. "You're guests," I said. "And at this point, guests who have overstayed. I need you both to leave. You're welcome to come back when you've been invited by the people whose names are in the deed." What followed was loud and not graceful. Marcus made calls in the driveway. Delia spent a long time in the bathroom. Their kids, confused and bored, sat on the porch steps. Eventually both vehicles left. My grandmother made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table while the afternoon light moved across the floor. The first weekend they visited, she said after a while, Marcus walked every inch of the property. He asked about the well output. He asked about the roof warranty. She wrapped her hands around her mug. I thought he was just interested. I should have called you. My grandfather came in from the porch and stood in the doorway. He asked about converting the barn, he said. I told him it wasn't my decision. He paused. It is my decision, actually. And I don't want to convert the barn. The posts went up 4 days later. Marcus first, then Delia sharing. Carefully worded commentary about generosity as a form of control. Nothing named. Everything implied. A distant cousin sent me a message. 2 of my grandmother's friends texted her with worried questions. I wrote one response. An email to both of them, with my firm's senior compliance officer copied, noting that any verifiable public statements referencing me, my grandparents, or the property would be addressed as defamation if materially false, and as tortious interference if they caused demonstrable harm to any protected interest under the trust. All future communication was to be directed through my office. The posts disappeared within 48 hours. 3 weeks later, my grandfather called on a Tuesday. There was a man on the porch, he said, holding a folder. Said he had a signed rental agreement. I told him to go inside and lock the door. I pulled up the property camera on my work computer. I'd had a system installed during the renovation, motion activated, feeding to an app on my phone, and called the county non-emergency line. Then I texted Marcus a still from the camera feed. I am watching this in real time. The trust is on file with the county and with local law enforcement. I suggest your contact leave before the deputy arrives. His reply took 3 minutes. Wrong address. Our mistake. Sorry. The car was gone before the deputy reached the road. That weekend I drove out with a locksmith and replaced all the entry hardware with keypad deadbolts. When I tested the system, my grandfather stood beside me watching the camera feeds cycle through on the kitchen tablet. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. What? How long I spent trying to take up as little space as possible. Not asking for too much. Making myself manageable. He was quiet for a moment. It never once occurred to me that I was allowed to say this is mine. This is not available. You don't get to touch this. You're allowed, I said. He smiled, the unguarded version I remembered from years ago. I know that now. Delia hasn't called. The door isn't locked from my side, but I'm not standing at it waiting. Marcus sent a short email 6 weeks after the driveway incident with a subject line that read, moving forward, 2 sentences acknowledging he'd handled things poorly. A request to revisit the conversation eventually. I read it once, moved it to a folder, and haven't replied. What I understand now is something I spent a long time getting wrong. I believed that caring for people meant absorbing their needs indefinitely. That if you named a limit, you were the one who had broken something. What I know now is that a limit isn't a rupture. It's what keeps the structure sound. I didn't restore that farmhouse to own anything, or to hold anything over anyone. I restored it because I could see clearly what my grandparents had earned, and I wanted to make it real. A place where my grandfather watches the light change over the hills without having to manage anyone else's reaction to his tremors. A place my grandmother can rearrange at her own pace with no one measuring the square footage. Have you ever given something completely time, money, effort, and then had to stand between it and the people who wanted to repurpose it? If so, you already understand that protecting what you built is not the same as withholding love. Sometimes it's the only way to make sure the love actually lands. The morning I found out where they'd be sitting, I didn't cancel their tickets. That was the detail everyone asked about afterward. The colleagues who knew the seating chart. The event coordinator who handed me that thick stapled packet across his desk. They all assumed I would have protected myself. That I would have pointed to row 3, and quietly said, "These names need to come off the list." Instead, I handed the packet back to him with both hands, told him the arrangement was perfect, and walked out into the afternoon light feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. My name is Nadia, and I am 31 years old. When I was 23, My mother called me 2 days before my sister's Princeton graduation and told me not to come. She didn't frame it as a request. She said, "Vivianne's friends come from a different world, Nadia. Their families have endowments named after them. We have spent everything building her reputation, and I am not going to let you show up in whatever you found on sale and start talking about your community health rotations. You will look like the hired help. So please, for everyone's sake, stay home." The line went dead before I could answer. I was standing in my kitchen holding a train ticket I'd purchased with a portion of my billing coordinator paycheck, the kind of job that pays just enough to feel like you're surviving, never enough to feel like you're living. I had taken 3 consecutive overnight shifts that week to clear my schedule for the trip. The trip I was no longer taking. I carefully removed the dress I'd bought from the back of my closet and replaced it on the hanger. I had also bought Vivienne a gift, a slim brushed silver pen with her initials engraved on the barrel. I had counted out folded bills at the register to pay for it. I wrapped it in a padded envelope, walked to the post office the following morning, and mailed it without a note. Not out of bitterness. Because I refused to let their contempt turn me small. I had no idea that same pen would end up in a donation bin 7 years later and become the single most clarifying object I have ever held in my hand. To understand how my mother could make that phone call without hesitation, you need to understand what our household ran on. We grew up in a meticulously maintained suburb where social standing was a full-time occupation. My sister Vivienne possessed my mother's bone structure, my mother's ease, and an almost supernatural gift for saying exactly what a room wanted to hear. My parents treated her future like a portfolio they were actively managing. Private tutors, application consultants, strategic extracurriculars, all of it funded without discussion. I learned my place during sophomore year when I asked my father for $60 to purchase a required anatomy textbook. He didn't look up from what he was doing. He said developing self-sufficiency builds character, and I should pick up additional hours at work. 20 minutes later, I watched him hand Vivienne his card to book a ski weekend with her friends because she needed to decompress from the stress of college applications. That was the dynamic. Her comfort was essential. My basic academic needs were inconvenient. I tried to bridge the distance anyway. I thought showing up to celebrate Vivienne's art history degree would finally demonstrate I was worth something to them. The phone call ended that theory. What followed was not a dramatic implosion. It was quieter than that. I blocked their numbers on a Sunday evening after watching my mother post a photograph from the ceremony captioned, "I put it down in a state of absolute bone-deep clarity." I changed my number the following Monday. I removed their names from my emergency contacts. I stopped performing for an audience that had never once turned to watch me. I channeled everything into my work. I was a billing coordinator at a regional hospital system, which sounds administrative until you understand what that position actually contains: an intimate architecture of clinical documentation, insurance codes, procedural records, and patient histories. I spent my breaks reading the charts I processed, teaching myself the diagnostic logic behind every claim I filed. I worked nights. I ate whatever the cafeteria had left it close. I studied for the Healthcare Administration certification exams using secondhand prep guides. The director of clinical operations at our hospital was a woman named Dr. Constance Wyeth. She had spent 30 years building one of the most rigorous compliance divisions in the northeastern region, and she possessed the particular ferocity of someone who had been underestimated for most of her career. She was not warm in any conventional sense. She was honest, which in my experience is rarer and worth considerably more. She noticed me during a quarterly audit review when I flagged a systemic billing error that had been generating significant overpayments to a vendor for 14 months. I had found it not because it was my job to find it, it was nobody's job to find it, but because I had been reading the underlying data closely enough to recognize the pattern. She called me into her office afterward and asked how long I'd been working there. When I told her, she asked why I wasn't in a graduate program. I told her the truth. I couldn't afford the application process, the entrance exams, the credential verification fees. My family didn't support my education. I was saving, but slowly. She set down her coffee with a sharp, definitive sound, and looked at me for a long moment. Then she wrote a phone number on a notepad, tore off the page, and slid it across the desk. She told me that kind of analytical instinct couldn't be manufactured in a classroom, and she was not going to watch it spend the next decade filing reimbursement claims. Dr. Wyeth became the mentor my parents chose never to be. She guided me through the application process for a fully funded master's program in health systems administration. She drilled me on policy frameworks during lunch. She submitted a letter of recommendation that I was not permitted to read, but that, based on what came next, must have contained something extraordinary. I was accepted with a full merit fellowship. I completed the degree in 2 years while continuing to work. During that time, I monitored my family's situation through a prepaid device I kept in my desk drawer, not because I wanted contact but because I had learned the value of situational awareness. The messages I read painted a portrait of slow structural collapse. Vivienne had moved to a city apartment funded by my parents, pursuing a career as a lifestyle content creator. When that architecture failed, and it failed incrementally, then all at once, she retreated back to Connecticut. My parents had depleted their savings, borrowed against their home, and exhausted their credit managing her lifestyle. My father had a health scare that required hospitalization. The system they had built around protecting her was beginning to buckle from the inside. I completed my graduate thesis on equity gaps in healthcare financial access, published a portion of it in a policy journal, and was recruited by a prominent regional health consortium to lead their compliance and operational integrity division. I was 29 years old. I accepted, relocated to New Haven, and said nothing to anyone in my biological family about any of it. 7 months into that role, I received an email from the executive director of a National Healthcare Administration conference asking me to deliver the keynote address at their annual convening. The invitation described me as a rising architect of equitable systems reform. I read it twice in my quiet office and then called Dr. Wyeth, who had moved into a senior advisory role at a Boston medical institution. When I relayed the invitation, she was silent for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard her voice, thick with something she almost never permitted herself to show. She said, "I found you reading billing codes during your break with worn-out shoes. And now you are going to stand at a national podium." I have never been prouder of another person in my life. 3 weeks before the conference, I walked through the events management corridor at the venue complex to finalize staging details. Near the service hallway, there was a collection bin for discarded items, forgotten umbrellas, cheap lanyards, abandoned office supplies. Something caught the light. I reached in and pulled out a slim silver pen. I turned it over. The engraved initials on the barrel read VC. Vivienne Calloway. My sister, who had recently accepted a logistical position with the venue's event staff after exhausting every other option, had carried my graduation gift to her new job and deposited it in a donation bin. I stood in that hallway for a full minute, turning the pen in my hand. It didn't hurt. The hurt had metabolized years ago into something harder and more useful. What the pen provided was clarity. A clean physical reminder of exactly who these people were when there was nothing in it for them. Vivienne was assigned to work the conference. My parents offered complimentary attendee tickets through her staff allocation, had accepted, expecting to spend an afternoon in proximity to institutional prestige, entirely unaware of who was speaking. The morning of the conference, I stood in front of my mirror and put on my conference suit, the kind I could now afford to own rather than borrow. I clipped the silver pen to my leather portfolio. I walked to the auditorium with Dr. Wyeth beside me. I did not feel nervous. Nervousness belongs to outcomes you cannot predict. I already knew with clinical precision how this would proceed. From my position on the stage, I found them in the third row of the reserve staff section before the program even began. My mother in a designer suit she could no longer comfortably afford. My father, rigid with the performance of composure. Vivienne in her event staff polo, bored, looking at her phone. When the moderator introduced me and I walked to the podium, I watched it happen in sequence. Vivienne's phone hitting the floor, my mother's color leaving her face, my father's hands gripping the armrests. I delivered the speech I had spent 3 weeks writing. I spoke about the cost of conditional belonging. I spoke about the patients lost between systems because nobody thought they were worth the paperwork. I spoke about the advisors and mentors who look past someone's circumstances to see their capacity. I did not mention my family by name. I did not have to. Every sentence landed exactly where I intended. The standing ovation was not what I remember most clearly. What I remember is the weight of the pen in my hand as I stepped back from the microphone. In the lobby afterward, my mother reached for me with both arms, her hat slightly off-center. The practiced matriarch dissolved into something desperate and unmoored. I stepped back before her hands found me. I told her in the same measured tone I used to deliver operational findings to a boardroom that I had stayed away because she asked me to, and I had honored that request faithfully. My father arrived and tried to claim access to the morning as though proximity to my achievement was a family entitlement. I told him you do not harvest what you refuse to plant. My sister arrived last, still wearing her lanyard, and accused me of staging the entire morning to humiliate them. I held up the silver pen. I explained where I had found it. I watched the recognition cross her face. What followed was the most honest thing Viviane had said in years, a raw, fractured admission that she had always known the difference between her performance and my substance, and that she had hated me for possessing what she had only been taught to simulate. My mother's response to her daughter's collapse was to grab her arm and tell her to stop making a scene. That single gesture contained the entire history of our family. I told them clearly, I had forgiven them, because carrying that particular weight was too expensive. But forgiveness is not the same as access. I was enforcing the boundary they had established. I was closing the door they had already closed. Then I turned and walked out into the afternoon. 6 months later, Dr. Wyeth and I formalized a grant program through my organization, specifically funding examination preparation and application costs for healthcare administration candidates from low-income backgrounds. We called it the Silver Pen Fund. The object that marked my lowest point became the instrument that opened something for dozens of people who came after me. The consequences for my family were the natural outcomes of choices compounding over time. The house was eventually foreclosed. The social architecture my mother had maintained for decades collapsed when the people who had witnessed the lobby scene carried the story back to their networks. Viviane lost her event position for conduct violations and months later was working a customer service shift at a corporate coffee chain, serving the very drinks she used to photograph as evidence of her aspirational life. I did not celebrate this. Gravity simply collects what it is owed. What I understand now, with the particular clarity that comes from standing on the other side of it, is that the people who try to make you invisible are usually terrified of what they'll have to confront once you become undeniable. My family built a hierarchy because hierarchies protect the people at the top from examining the cost of their position. The table I built has room for people who show up, not for people who claim a seat because of biological proximity to someone else's labor. Have you ever had someone try to reintroduce themselves to a version of you that they spent years trying to bury and found that the person they were looking for simply no longer existed? The email arrived at 7:43 in the morning on a Wednesday, and I almost didn't open it. I was standing in the lobby of a Marriott in Denver, travel mug in one hand, leather portfolio tucked under my arm, 12 minutes from a client site visit with a regional hospital group that had hired me to audit their vendor payment systems. My phone buzzed. The sender was my mother, Renata. The subject line read, "Don't come back early. Enjoy starting over." I opened it because I thought it was about the heating bill. Or the plumber. Or one of the 100 small pointed complaints she had been routing through my inbox since I'd made the miscalculation of inviting her to live with me. It was 3 paragraphs. Short. Almost breezy. She and my sister Danny had made a decision. They had cleared the house furniture, electronics, jewelry, the cedar chest my grandmother had brought from Guadalajara, loaded everything into a moving truck, and driven south to Scottsdale, where Danny had found a short-term rental. The last line read, "Your savings are already taken care of. You were always better at being alone anyway." I read it twice. Then a third time. Then I smiled. Not from relief. Not from shock. The specific quiet smile that comes when something you spent months preparing for finally arrives and you realize the preparation was enough. My name is Margot Delgado. I'm 36 years old. For the past 11 years, I have worked in healthcare compliance consulting, which means hospital networks and insurance intermediaries pay me to find where money disappears before the disappearance becomes a scandal. I am by professional formation a person who does not leave important things unguarded. I read contracts the way other people read menus. I keep records the way other people keep grudges, carefully organized by date, and never thrown away. Renata and Danny had not accounted for that. Let me go back. My father, Ernesto, died 20 months before the events I'm describing. Pulmonary embolism. Fast. The kind of death that doesn't give you time to prepare the people around you for what losing you will mean. He left behind a life insurance policy, a 16-year-old Subaru, and a family architecture. Danny is 5 years older than me. She was the one my mother worried about, organized around, returned to whenever things went sideways. Danny had dropped out of a graduate program, accumulated debt, cycled through cities and roommates and jobs with a kind of restless charm that my mother called finding herself, and that I had watched from the outside for years without being able to name what bothered me about it. I had put myself through a university program on academic scholarship, worked weekends, graduated without debt, and built a career that required precision and discipline. My mother's response to those years was usually a brief nod, as if I had simply done what anyone would do. After Ernesto died, Renata said she couldn't manage the house alone. She was 63, in good health, fully capable of independent life. But grief makes people say things, and I was not immune to my own grief either. So I invited her to stay with me in the house I had bought in Sacramento at 31. Then Danny just needed a few months to regroup. Those months became 3 years. I paid the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries, the property taxes, the homeowner's insurance. I drove Renata to her appointments. I handled the estate paperwork when my father died, all of it, while running a consulting practice that required me to travel 4 or 5 days most months. In return, I was treated the way useful things are treated, relied upon and resented. The small signs came in sequence, the way they always do. Danny started asking questions about my banking setup about 9 months before Denver. Casual, folded into ordinary conversation. Do you use a credit union or a regular bank? Is your savings account the same one you use for the utilities? I told myself she was thinking about consolidating her own accounts. I told myself it was nothing. Then I noticed mail being opened and resealed. Not obviously, just slightly misaligned at the fold, the corner lifted and pressed back down in a way that was almost invisible. One piece, then two. I told myself it was the humidity. Then Renata started standing in doorways when I paid household bills. Not asking anything. Just present, eyes moving toward the laptop screen, without quite landing there. The moment of cold clarity came on a Thursday evening in April. I came home from a 2-day client trip to find Danny at the small desk in my home office, sitting with her back to the door, working something out on paper with a printed bank statement I had left in the recycling bin. She closed the paper quickly when she heard me. Said she was just using the desk. Her expression was not embarrassed. It was interrupted. I didn't say anything. I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed with my hands very still in my lap. I didn't feel panic. I felt the particular cold clarity that arrives when something you've been quietly categorizing as probably nothing reveals itself as something. That night I called my attorney, Philip Weston. Philip is 51, former banking litigator, now runs a private practice in Sacramento focused on asset protection and civil disputes. He has a deliberate, unrattled quality that makes chaotic situations feel containable. When I told him what I'd seen, he was quiet for a moment. Then how much of your full financial picture do they have? I said, probably too much. He said, then we start today. Not after. That was the beginning of 5 months of careful, quiet work. Philip brought in a forensic accountant named Clara Ibanez, 15 years of experience in asset tracing and fraud documentation. She reviewed my records within a week and produced a 12-page report documenting unauthorized activity going back 8 months. Small amounts, irregular intervals, from an account Renata had limited access to for household expenses. The restructuring was methodical. The bulk of my savings was moved out of the account Renata believed was my primary repository. What remained in the visible account was a structured holding balance, legitimate funds, but arranged so that any unauthorized transfer would create a documented paper trail across state lines, triggering federal statutes on wire fraud. I photographed every item of value in the house. Serial numbers, purchase receipts, insurance valuations. Several pieces I suspected Danny had been appraising were quietly replaced with insured replicas after Clara confirmed the appraisal research in the browsing history of the household tablet, which Danny used regularly and assumed was not monitored. It was monitored. I updated the security system to a private cloud backup they had no knowledge of. Full audio and video coverage of the main entry, the living room, and the front exterior. I removed Renata from the household expense account and replaced her access with a limited use card, $200 ceiling with real-time alerts to my phone. Then I waited. The consulting trip to Denver was scheduled in early November. I told Renata and Danny 10 days in advance and watched their reactions carefully. Danny nodded quickly and left the room. Renata asked what day I was leaving. Both responses were slightly off in a way I couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't been watching as long as I had. I left on a Monday. By Wednesday morning, while I was reviewing vendor contract discrepancies on the 4th floor of a hospital administrative building, the email arrived. I stood in the lobby and breathed for 40 seconds. My hands were cold. Something at the back of my throat wanted to become a sound I was not going to make in a hotel lobby. Then I forwarded the email to Philip. Then I called my bank's fraud contact, a senior specialist named Adrian Cole, a relationship Philip had established specifically for this possibility 6 months earlier. Then I opened my laptop and checked the security archive. The moving truck had arrived at 8:40 that morning. The footage was 14 minutes long. I watched my house emptied room by room, the dining table, the framed photographs, the cedar chest, the record player Ernesto and I had rebuilt together when I was 19. Danny's voice came through the audio clearly. At one point she said, "Take everything that has value first. Leave the books." I closed the laptop, stood up, walked into my next meeting. I am a professional. I was not going to let them take that too. By that evening, Philip had filed emergency notices with Sacramento PD's Property Crimes Division, the bank's fraud unit, and a federal reporting channel. The movement of property across state lines and the attempted transfer of funds from flagged accounts triggered jurisdiction under federal statute. Philip had also contacted the Scottsdale Rentals Management Office, whose confirmation email Renata had mistakenly forwarded to a shared family account I still had read access to. The property manager cooperated immediately. He had no interest in the middle of a fraud case. Adrian Cole confirmed within 2 hours that the account Renata had accessed was frozen pending investigation. The transfer Renata believed she had completed had processed into a review queue. The funds were inaccessible. The paper trail attached to every digit. I flew home the next morning. The house was stripped. I unlocked the front door at 11:17 and stood in the entry and let the silence settle. No rug. No console table. No photograph of my father and me at my graduate pinning ceremony, which had hung in that hallway for 4 years. The hooks where my coat and Renata's coat had hung side by side were bare. The air smelled like packing tape, and the specific absence of everything familiar. I put on latex gloves. Philip had told me to treat the house as a potential evidence scene and photographed every room. Every empty bracket. Every drawer left crooked. Renata had left a printed note on the kitchen floor beside the open safe. She had taken the $800 in emergency cash I had placed there deliberately, along with documents formatted to look like account information. She had not looked under the bottom shelf. Taped there was a small index card in my handwriting that said, "Check the account names again." I photographed it in place, then peeled it off and put it in my bag. Then I poured a glass of water, because it was the one thing they hadn't taken that I needed right then, and I waited. Danny called first at 6:58. I let it go. Renata called at 7:40, then 7:43. On the fourth attempt I answered. She skipped hello. Renata has not said hello to me in years. I note that as documentation, not grievance, and launched straight in, her voice pitched high, tight. What did you do? The card isn't working. The transfer is frozen. The rental office is asking about payment. I leaned against the stripped kitchen counter. Outside the window, a neighbor's sprinkler was running. A completely ordinary Thursday morning. Help with what? I said. The accounts? What accounts? I said. The ones that belong to me. Danny grabbed the phone. I could hear wind and traffic. Stop playing games. Whatever you reported, undo it. We're here and it's your fault. I didn't take anything, I said. You did, she said. You took my property. You emptied my house. And your mother sent me a written description of exactly what happened, with a subject line. That email was between family, Renata shouted from somewhere behind her. I wrote that line on a notepad immediately after hanging up. Philip laughed for a full 10 seconds when I read it to him. She had sent a written account of felony theft to my professional email address and believed it was a private family communication. What followed was not cinematic. Real legal processes are spreadsheets and scheduled calls and documents filed with exhibit numbers. My neighbor Greta Sandoval had seen the moving truck that morning and filmed 42 seconds on her phone. Danny clearly visible in the doorway, her voice audible on the clip. A detective named Lorraine Castillo was assigned through Sacramento's property crimes unit, and she reviewed the security footage, Greta's clip, Renata's email, and Clara's financial documentation in a single 3-hour session. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "You did half our work already." "It's what I do for a living," I said. She almost smiled. The civil settlement came 4 months later. Renata's attorney negotiated it to avoid a full trial. Structured repayment of misappropriated funds. Return or replacement value for removed property. A formal acknowledgement filed with the case record that the removal had been unauthorized. Danny's separate restitution agreement included a probationary structure that would escalate to criminal charges if violated. Between the recovery, the insurance claim, and the restitution payments, I got back approximately 89% of what had been taken. Real life leaves dents. I rebuilt the house the way I'd always wanted it. Bought a dining table alone on a Saturday morning. Repainted the 2 back rooms. Turned Danny's old bedroom into an office for my consulting practice. Standing desk, second monitor, proper chair, and within 60 days was running 3 new client contracts out of that space. The room that had held 3 years of someone else's chaos and my own unreciprocated patience was now the room where I was building what came next. That was my favorite part. I won't pretend otherwise. Renata called once more, about 7 weeks after the settlement. She wanted to know if there was a path back to a relationship. I thought about that question for a moment. I thought about 11 years of being the one who paid and worked and showed up and managed and stayed. I thought about the calculator, the resealed mail, the doorway she stood in while I paid bills. I thought about the email and her voice from a Scottsdale hotel lobby saying she had just wanted Danny to have a real life, as though my life were a resource she was entitled to redirect. I don't know, I said. Not right now. She hung up first. Here is the only thing I'll say directly to you. I did not set a trap. That framing is how people who've been caught prefer to tell the story. What I did was notice, document, and protect myself from a threat I watched develop in my own home over nearly a year. What Renata and Danny called a trap is just reality. When you take something that doesn't belong to you, the records kept by the person you took it from. That is not cruelty. That is accounting. People who take from family depend on a single assumption above everything else, that love means you won't enforce what's yours. That you'll be too hurt to be methodical, too guilty to file a report, too afraid of being called cold to protect yourself. I had spent 36 years being taught that lesson. I had finally decided it wasn't one I needed to keep learning. So here is what I'll leave you with. If someone in your life has been making you feel that protecting yourself is a betrayal of them, the surgeon found me in the hallway. Not in the room where my daughter was fighting to stay alive, in the hallway, standing between two security guards and my older sister Dana, who had arranged herself against the ICU doors like she owned them. Which, given our family's relationship to ownership, probably felt natural to her. "Sir." The guard nearest me had his hand raised, not quite touching my arm. "Family only." "Sir, he is family," I said, because I'd been saying some version of that sentence for 11 years. Dana turned toward me with the particular expression she reserved for situations she believed she was managing. "There's been some confusion," she told the guard. "This is our family's personal driver. He's been with us for years. Very devoted. But the policy is clear." I had stopped crying somewhere between the parking garage and the third floor. What replaced it was something quieter and more precise. I watched Dana perform her competence for the security team, and I thought, she actually believes this will work. Then the ICU doors opened. My wife came through them, still in her surgical cap, the ties loose around her neck, her eyes moving across the hallway until they found mine. Dr. Renata Solis, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at St. Augustine Medical Center. The woman I had married at a courthouse in Austin 11 years ago, with her mother and my college roommate as witnesses. She looked at the guard. She looked at Dana. She looked at me. Why is my husband in the hallway? Have you ever watched someone realize in real time that a plan has failed? Not just failed, reversed. Dana's expression moved through several stages in quick succession: confusion, recognition, the specific horror of a person who has deployed a weapon. Renata didn't wait for an explanation. She stepped past the guard, took my hand, and said, "Lily is stable. Come inside." I went inside. My family, the Aldercott side, had never accepted Renata. This requires some context. My father, Warren Aldercott, built a regional insurance empire in the 1980s and spent the following decades converting money into the particular kind of social authority that masquerades as culture. My mother, Constance, was the architect of our family's reputation. Every charity board membership, every club affiliation. My sister Dana had performed admirably, marrying a mergers attorney named Graham who spent his summers in the right places and his winters making the right calls. And then there was me, Philip, who had fallen in love with a surgical resident from San Antonio, whose parents owned a tire shop, and who had worked her way to the top of her field through 15 years of relentless, precise labor. A doctor, my mother had said, the first Thanksgiving I'd brought Renata home. She'd managed to make the word sound like a mispronunciation of something worse. How very industrious. "She's going to be one of the best cardiac surgeons in the country," I'd said. "Surgeons work with their hands, Philip." Renata had heard all of it. She'd finished her wine, thanked my mother for dinner, and never returned to that house. We'd married 6 months later. My family did not attend. What they did not know, and what I had never corrected them on, was that Renata had assembled the team now working on our daughter. Lily was 10 years old, funny and loud and astonishing in the specific way that children are when they've absorbed the best of two people. She'd collapsed at swim practice 3 days earlier. An arrhythmia, hidden and waiting, the kind that announces itself without warning. The surgery had been scheduled for that morning. Renata couldn't operate on Lily. No surgeon operates on their own child. But she had called in the best people she knew, which meant the best people in the region. It wasn't supposed to go wrong. Then Lily's heart had stuttered on the table, and the code alarm had sounded, and I had been in the family waiting room alone when Dana arrived. I hadn't told my family. Hospitals have boards, and boards have members, and members talk. Someone at St. Augustine knew someone who knew someone, and the information had traveled through the usual channels until it reached my mother. Not to help. To represent. Dana had found me tear-blind and barely functional. She'd settled into the chair across from me and said, "Mother thought someone should be here," in a tone that implied Renata's absence from the waiting room was evidence of marital indifference rather than the fact that my wife was coordinating a surgical response to our daughter's cardiac arrest. When the code alarm sounded 20 minutes later, I ran. Dana followed. She moved faster, reaching the nurse's station first, already speaking to the security team by the time I arrived. "That man," she'd said, and pointed at me, a gesture so casual it must have taken practice. "He's not family. He's employed by the family. The father is on his way." I was wearing a gray pullover and hadn't shaved in 3 days. I understood how I looked. "Sir," the guard had said, "I'm going to need you to step back. My daughter is behind those doors." My voice had been steady, which surprised me. "I am her father." "That's what he keeps saying," Dana told them. "He's very attached." "It's a difficult situation." Renata came through the doors before I found any more words. What happened after was swift and in its way complete. Dana was escorted from the building. The hospital's incident team documented the encounter. Interference with patient family access, false report to security staff, impersonation of a family representative. Renata didn't press for formal action. I asked her not to, and she agreed because Lily's recovery deserved to happen in quiet. But the Aldercott reputation is a social infrastructure, and social infrastructure is fragile in specific ways. The people who mattered in that world, the board members, the donors, the families whose children went to the same schools and whose names appeared on the same programs, heard about what Dana had done. The story moved through the same networks that had delivered Dana to the hospital in the first place, only now it carried different cargo. "Did you hear about Warren Aldercott's daughter? Tried to have her own brother-in-law removed from the hospital while his daughter was in surgery. Called him the help. My mother called 4 days later. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail in the careful, measured tone she used when managing a situation she'd already decided was a misunderstanding. I deleted it. Lily came home 3 weeks later. She spent 2 months recovering in a way that looked from the outside like ordinary childhood: books, complaints about the no-running rule, arguments about screen time, and then she was herself again, maybe more herself, with the particular confidence of someone who has been close to something and returned. She asked about the hallway. We'd discussed how much to tell her, Renata and we had decided on the truth in age-appropriate portions. "Your Aunt Dana told the hospital I wasn't your father," I told her. "She said I was an employee." "Why?" "Because our family never accepted Renata. They thought she wasn't good enough because of where she came from. Dana was trying to punish me for marrying her." Lily was quiet for a moment. "That's a really stupid reason." "Yes." "Are we going to see them again?" "No," she nodded, with the uncomplicated acceptance that children sometimes have for facts that adults spend years negotiating. "Good." I didn't really like how they talked about Mom anyway. My parents tried once more, 6 months after the incident. They arrived at our door unannounced, my father in his good coat, my mother with the expression she wore when she was prepared to be gracious. Renata answered, because she'd been home between shifts, and I stood behind her. "We'd like to see Lily," my mother said. "No," Renata said. "We're her grandparents. You spent 10 years pretending she didn't exist unless it was convenient to mention her." Renata's voice was the same voice she used in surgical briefings, exact without weather. "Your daughter told a security team that Philip was an employee, so she could keep him from Lily, while Lily was in cardiac arrest. And you called 4 days later to tell us it was a misunderstanding." She paused. "It wasn't a misunderstanding." She closed the door. "They didn't come back." I saw Dana once more about a year later. A hospital foundation gala. The kind of event where Renata was being recognized for a training program she'd built for residents from under-resourced hospitals. We were there because the work mattered to her, because she had come from exactly the kind of place that program was designed to serve. Dana was there, of course. These events were her native terrain. She saw me across the room, and for a moment I thought she might approach, might attempt some calibrated public gesture of repair. Instead, she turned and walked to the opposite side of the room. Renata found me watching. "You okay?" "I'm fine." And I meant it in a way that had taken time to become true. "She can't reach us anymore." Renata looked at me the way she sometimes does, as if checking something. "She couldn't reach us before. She just thought she could." That's the thing I've had to sit with in the years since. My family had spent decades making me feel like a category error, someone who had made a wrong turn and produced the wrong life. But Renata had become the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at a major medical center. Our daughter had survived something that kills people every year. And when it mattered most, my wife had walked through those doors and chosen me in front of everyone who thought they understood the hierarchy of our lives. The people who raised me never chose me. The family I built with Renata chooses me every day. Lily turns 12 next month. She's joined the swim team again, which her cardiologist cleared and which she announced with the specific satisfaction of someone reclaiming something. Renata is taking 3 days off, almost unheard of. And we're planning something small and deliberate and ours. Dad, Lily asked me last week in the offhand way she asks the questions that matter most. When I'm older, will you be there? For everything. I pulled her into a hug. Every moment you'll let me witness. Every hard thing and every ordinary Tuesday. Promise? Promise. My sister called me a hired driver while my daughter was in cardiac arrest. My wife walked out of the ICU to find out why her husband was standing in a hallway. The security guard turned white. And I understood in that terrible corridor that the family willing to show up for you will always outweigh the family that trained you to feel grateful for the scraps of their attention. Lily is healthy. Renata is my home. The Aldercotts are strangers. I've thought a long time about what it costs to finally believe you deserve the life you've built. The answer, I think, is almost everything, and then nothing at all. Have you ever asked yourself how long you spent waiting for people who never intended to arrive? The envelope had been sitting in Mr. Gerald Harmon's office for 18 months before I ever knew it existed. My mother had sealed it herself, written my name on the front in the careful, unhurried cursive she used for everything important, and handed it to him on a Tuesday afternoon while she could still drive herself to appointments. I found all of this out on a Wednesday morning in late February, sitting across from a man I hadn't seen since I was 12. While outside his window the city moved through its ordinary business without the slightest awareness that something was being returned to me. Let me back up. My name is Nora. I'm 28. My mother, Diane, died of ovarian cancer 6 years ago, when I was 22 and finishing my last semester of college. She was diagnosed 2 years before that, and for those 2 years I drove the 4 hours between my campus and our house in Asheville. I sat with her through infusions. I learned which anti-nausea medications worked, and which ones didn't. I became, without anyone formally asking me to, the person who kept the household organized while my father, Warren, increasingly failed to show up for that job or any other. Warren had met someone. Her name was Claudette. She worked in the leasing office of a commercial real estate firm, where my father handled account management, and she was 31 years old to his 53. I found out 7 months before my mother died. I did not tell my mother, because she already knew. She told me so herself, quietly, one afternoon when we were sitting in her garden, the one she'd spent 15 years building. She said she didn't have the bandwidth to fight on 2 fronts, and she had chosen the one that mattered. She was right. She was almost always right about things like that. 3 weeks before she died, she asked me to sit with her in the bedroom while Warren was out. She held both of my hands and told me she had spoken with her attorney, a man named Leonard Marsh, who had handled the financial and estate affairs of her family for nearly 25 years. She said, "Nora, whatever happens after I'm gone, you are covered." I made sure. Trust Leonard. I nodded. I told her I loved her. I didn't ask for specifics because I was 22 and I could not fully accept that I was going to need them. She died on a Friday morning in November. Warren grieved with appropriate public visibility for about 8 months. Then Claudette moved into the house. Then 14 months after that, they married in a small destination ceremony in Charleston. I received my invitation 11 days before the date. I attended because my mother had raised me to conduct myself with steadiness regardless of the conditions around me, and I was not going to let the occasion be the moment I stopped. Claudette was warm to me in the performative way of someone who has already decided the relationship will be on her terms. I was pleasant in return. My mother's photographs came down from the hallway. Her garden was dismantled and re-landscaped. Her recipe notebooks, which she had kept since her 20s, disappeared from the kitchen shelf. I visited infrequently and kept the conversations light. Then on a Sunday evening in February, my father called and asked me to come for dinner. I believed it was a reconciliation attempt. I drove up, sat down at a table that no longer felt like any table I had ever eaten at, and listened while Claudette, speaking in the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this. She said $380,000 sitting in a protected account was essentially selfish when the family had financial needs. She used that word. Selfish. She was wearing a silk blouse I was almost entirely certain I had seen in my mother's closet. I looked at my father. He had set down his fork. He said, "Your mom would have wanted you to take care of the people who matter to me now." Something went quiet inside me. Not grief. Something older and colder than grief. I said I would think about it. I finished enough of my food to look composed. I drove home and called Leonard Marsh's office at 8 the next morning. His assistant picked up. I gave my name, and Leonard came on the line within 40 seconds. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Nora, your mother built for exactly this. Come in tomorrow. You don't need to bring anything. I have everything here." Leonard Marsh's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that had been there since the 70s. Dark wood, legal volumes, a faint smell of coffee and old paper. He was 72, methodical, with the unhurried quality of someone who had seen enough human behavior to be unsurprisable. He stood when I came in, shook my hand and set a thick manila folder on the desk without opening it immediately. Instead, he slid a sealed envelope toward me. My name on the front, in my mother's handwriting. I had not seen her handwriting in 6 years. I had to press my back teeth together before I could breathe normally. He said she had prepared it 19 months before she died. He said she had told him, and he read it from a note in the file, that she hoped she was wrong about what she was preparing for. Inside the envelope was a letter, 5 pages, both sides in the same handwriting she'd used on birthday cards my entire life. She had moved her inheritance, money from her own parents' estate that had never legally or morally belonged to Warren, into a protected irrevocable trust in my name alone, completed 14 months before she became too ill to manage the paperwork herself. The trust carried specific conditions. No spouse of Warren's could access it or petition against it. No amount above $15,000 could be withdrawn without my signature and a mandatory 96-hour waiting window, a clause Leonard confirmed she had specifically requested to prevent anyone from pressuring me into a fast decision. That was not what undid me. The last 2 pages of the letter were not about money. She wrote about watching me grow up. About the way I used to leave glasses of water on her nightstand before she ever asked. About a road trip we'd taken to the Outer Banks when I was 17, when she let me drive the last stretch of highway in the dark and pretended the whole time that she wasn't nervous. She wrote that I had spent my life making sure everyone around me had what they needed before I checked whether I had what I needed, and that she was asking me, formally and in writing. She told me to finish the graduate certificate I had put on hold. She told me to travel somewhere that would require me to be uncomfortable. She told me to build something I cared about and commit to it without measuring it against what anyone else expected of me. She signed it with her first name only. Diane. Not Mom. Like she was writing to me as one adult to another. I sat in that office chair and cried in a way I hadn't permitted myself since her funeral. Leonard placed a box of tissues on the corner of the desk and said nothing, which was, I understood immediately, the precise right response. That evening I drove to Asheville. I did not call ahead. I brought a sealed copy of the trust documents Leonard had prepared and left them in an envelope addressed to Warren and Claudette on the kitchen counter. Warren opened it while I stood in the doorway with my coat still on. I watched his face as he read. I watched the moment he understood that my mother had seen all of this coming and had answered it, calmly and thoroughly, from 18 months in the past. His face went through several things. At the end of it, he cried. Not, I think, from guilt alone. I think he cried because he finally understood what kind of woman he had failed to show up. Claudette put her hand on his shoulder. I picked up my bag and walked out. I haven't been back. The trust is intact. I completed my certificate in archival studies last spring. I booked a flight to the Azores for September, an archipelago my mother had kept a travel magazine photograph of on her desk for years. I think about her every day, but the quality of the thinking has shifted. The grief is still there. It will always be there. But underneath it now is something else, something that feels like being known completely by another person, not despite your flaws but including them, and being protected by that person even after she was no longer able to protect herself. She was not a woman who raised her voice. She handled everything the way she handled her illness, with patience, precision, and full intention. Claudette demanded what my mother had left me. My mother had already responded, long before the question was ever asked. Have you ever considered what it means to be loved not in the moment, but in advance by someone who understood exactly what was coming and made sure you wouldn't have to face it unprepared?